Today I want to discuss some of New World's biggest problems and some things that they need to fix in order for the game to kind of survive the upcoming years. These are some of my biggest problems with the game overall. And first thing I wanted to discuss is the balancing between PvE and PvP. Another thing I want to talk about is the ability problem, and that is just I feel like there's a lack of abilities in the game. This goes for all weapons, not just any weapon specific, but most weapons for PvE and PvP will generally have the exact same builds with very few minor passive changes here and there, but most weapons will generally follow the same build. For example, if we touch Rapier here, most Rapier players will run something like I have here, or they'll drop Flourish and Finish and run either Riposte or Flurry as their third ability. And then there's some variants there, but overall I think builds in this game are very stock standard or copy and paste where they use a lot of the same things. I think what they should do personally is add a whole nother weapon tree. So instead of Blood to Grace, we get a third tree over here that had 3 more abilities and a whole nother tree of passives. Increase our overall weapon mastery. Instead of 20, maybe we could have 30 or 35 points here. Give us, a lot more build diversity. Now it would make the game more hard to balance, but I feel like part of the fun in the game is to simply be able to make more builds and have more unique playstyles. I feel like the game is kind of lacking in that department where everything kind of feels like the same and it's very mundane when everyone runs the same build, everyone's running this or that. And now there definitely is some diamonds in the rough where people will find occasional really strong builds, such as BB with Great Axe here and the Tempest Fury setup where you just infinitely kite, like stuff like that. You definitely can find some cool builds, but overall most builds are generally copy and paste, and I think that is a not good aspect in the game. I feel like a good way to introduce that would having another weapon skill tree with 3 abilities. And then what you could do with that, instead of having 6 abilities, we can now have 8 or even 10 abilities, which would drastically increase the overall feel of the combat. You could balance this by increasing cooldowns across the board, so they're not super spamming, since we now have basically double the abilities and whatnot. I know a big problem for a lot of players that I've at least talked to have tried New World and quit. A lot of my personal friends and friends of friends, they always tell me one of the main reasons they quit the game is because they feel like 6 abilities is just not enough for an MMO. And I can definitely see where they're coming from on this standpoint. I feel like 6 is definitely a little low for an MMO. They should be around 8 to 10 in my opinion. And the best way to do that is just to, once again, increase another tree here to add more build variety, more skills. I think more skills is more fun for everyone because that's means more in-depth gameplay. It would increase the skill cap, increase build diversity. I think it'd be very good for the overall state of the game. Now that's a lot of content they have to add, and that brings us into the next point, and that is the lack of content New World has been having for many years. We've been on the same OPR map since the release of the game, which is just insane. We've had 1 OPR map, the release in 2021. We've been giving 2 3v3 maps, and I believe the last one came out at Brimstone, which was 2 years ago. Over 2 years ago, we had 2 3v3 maps, not one since, so zero PvP content, and a lot of people who like playing this game are PvP enjoyers or PvE. And in terms of the PvE side, we also have very rarely gotten. In the last 3 years, we've had 2 raids, the Hive of Gorgons and the Trial of the Devourer, but the Worm has not gotten any big update. I had a little bit of an update on Aeternum patch, but nothing too overhaul. You've already done a Worm before Aeternum, it's basically the same thing, just more difficult than the previous patch. And if we come down here to Hive of Gorgons, right, this is a cool raid and it's definitely long, but I feel like these should be pumped out each season. Each season we should be getting a new raid, or at least every 2 seasons. There's 4 seasons generally New World likes to do per year. So I'd like to see at least 2 to 3 raids a year would be ideal, and then add a couple dungeons here and there. We also have been getting basically no dungeons. Once again, on this, in over a year, right, we've gotten 1 raid, I believe 0 dungeons, and then we got these soul trials, which are basically just the bosses that you already fight, and they're extremely easy, and they're also just pointless, man. There's really almost no reason to do soul trials. Once you get the artifact, you're basically in and out, you're done. You don't have to touch soul trials anymore. You also have this cool little winter rune forge over here. Not the soul trial, but the raid here, it's 10 people. It's like a mini raid, it's only 10. I don't think that counts as a raid. And I feel like just the overall lack of content is really lackluster, and it needs to be addressed. January 20th, I believe the patch is coming out, season 7 for New World. It's gonna be adding PvP worlds. I don't think they're adding much more content to the actual game, which I think is a big mistake. We are getting a preview of the OPR map, but I just don't think that's enough, man. People need content, and that's why people end up quitting, I believe, New World. It's just because there's no content. I think New World has a lot of good things. I think the crafting and the gathering is the best I've ever seen out of any MMO. The combat feels nice. You can love or hate the combat. That's just totally up to you. Combat is very subjective from person to person, and I feel like there's just generally no right or wrong answer when it comes to combat. I've heard people love New World combat. Some people hate it. Combat is combat. As long as it feels good. And New World combat, in my opinion, does feel good. That's all that really matters. Now, if you are a DPS for PvE, you basically are locked into one weapon, and that is always the finisher. You can pair this with other weapons like Fire Staff, Ice Golem. You can really pair with whatever you want, but you always have to have the finisher to always be doing maximum DPS. And if you're not using the finisher as your primary weapon, you generally won't get into a lot of Gorgon or Worm groups because nothing else can come close to its damage. Except the Serenity, but Serenity is extremely hard to get, and the PvP tracks are extremely unfair in my opinion with how much effort and work you have to put in to get something like the Serenity. If you don't know, Serenity comes from these PvP tracks. I'm currently 174. I got this at 139 on the third checkpoint right here, which is about 2 months of playing PvP for multiple hours a day, which most people aren't going to be doing, playing PvP for 2 months straight, multiple hours a day, and I finally got lucky and I got the Serenity. Even at 174, I have not gotten Ankh, the last remaining artifact on the PvP track. So if I got extremely unlucky, Ankh could instead be Serenity, and I cannot have Serenity at this point in time, which would be very unfortunate. And it feels very unfair when you have to do all that grinding on PvP track just in order to get the Serenity, when you can do any other dungeon or any other type of mechanic in the game to get any other artifact, and it takes less than 5 tries to guarantee the drop, where you can put multiple hours into your character, grinding out OPRs, arenas, doing your open world quests in areas like Great Cleave. I've seen people farm here for hours, just farming their PvP track up because they want a certain item from the PvP track. And since it's so RNG, these players can be locked here for tens of hours, where someone just has to go, and if I want Inferno, I just have to do Forge 5 times, and I'm guaranteed to get Inferno, the Fire Staff artifact. I think that's very bad, and I do think they need to definitely rework part of the PvP track system. If they plan on keeping the XP the same, I recommend instead of every like 10 tracks, you have a chance to get the artifact below 100. They should increase it to every 3 tracks or maybe every 2 tracks, and this would give a substantial boost in the amount of artifacts you can get before PvP track 100, which should help a lot of players and reduce a lot of the overall annoyance in the PvP grind. A lot of people come to my chat and always tell me they don't want to grind for certain weapons because it feels so long, it feels tedious, especially people who don't enjoy PvP in general. Like, a lot of people like PvEing and they don't want to PvP at all, and they want a certain artifact from the PvP track. Forcing people to grind this endlessly is really annoying. But back to the balancing problems I have with PvE DPS. So once again, back to the finisher here. So since you're not able to get the Serenity because it's extremely difficult to get, you're forced to always run the finisher for pretty much every PvE DPS build. And I think this is very boring for a lot of players, including myself, because it means if you want to get into any Gorgon or Worm group, or even generally M3s, you have to be running the finisher as either your primary or secondary, but generally your primary weapon. This is because the finisher has that 15% damage increase, which is extremely useful, but also the general damage that the rapier can pump out is just so much higher than the other weapons in the game. Ranged weapons have no chance of keeping up with it in terms of DPS unless the boss is very specifically designed to be killed by range. The finisher will generally just outpump all range and all other melee options. This forces everyone once again to only use the finisher, which really reduces build variety, and it forces players to play one weapon only pretty much in every PvE scenario. This is very boring because generally you have other classes spicing up what you're doing in the dungeon, but in this game it's weapons, and since you're always forced to use the same weapon, this really can kill the overall build variety, enjoyment, and just seeing new things, because the finisher is just too good. And I think they don't need to nerf the finisher, they just need to buff other melee weapons. I understand that there is other builds such as like rem bots and stuff like that are there for utility, but here I'm just primarily talking about the overall DPS side of things, and I feel like they just need to buff other melee weapons to be able to contend with the finisher. Next, I want to talk about PvP in the sense of balancing. I feel like there's two big problems right now, and that is range is super oppressive, and I feel like that makes a lot of things boring in terms of OPR, even sometimes arenas, and just all that. Not talking about wars. Wars is a completely different ball game, but most people don't play wars. Most people are OPRs or 3v3 players, and because of that, I feel like the range meta is super annoying, oppressive, and boring. Like, it's just fire staff almost everywhere you look in OPR, and that's because fire staff is completely overtuned, and in range in general is just completely overtuned. You either have the fire staff rats doing a bunch of AoE damage, the 5-con musketeers where they run like 350 dex, all intelligence, and like run 25 con or something like that, are very frustrating to fight. Like, all this stuff is very annoying because it feels like very unfun to fight someone that you have no way to kill generally, especially if they're pairing it with the rapier. They're extremely hard to catch, and the only general way you can catch these types of players if you're running a very specific build, such as S&S hatchet, like something that can dive really hard, and you have to be in light generally to catch a light rapier range player, which can feel very annoying and frustrating for a lot of melee players. And I feel like this only reinforces everyone playing range, because range is not only a lot easier than melee, it just makes it's just more rewarding and fun, because it's not frustrating shooting another guy from halfway across the map. It's a lot more frustrating to run someone down and them just infinitely kite you because they have rapier and they're in light armor, and your melee weapon just can't track them at all. And the only weapon that can generally deal with that is an S&S or sword and shield, because the leaping strike here is very good at gap closing, and blocking is very useful as well, because blocking can mitigate a lot of overall range damage. So I feel like in terms of this, they need to nerf range a bit. I think light roll is very oppressive and needs to be looked at. I think the best way to deal with that issue is just to buff melee tracking. In general, melee tracking is horrific right now, and I feel like you can never track through a roll. Like, if you attack someone right and they rolled, the game won't even register you attacking them, so you get zero tracking when someone dodges or anything like that. Even if they dodge late or early, your weapon just has no tracking, and if they do that and you attack, you're not only standing still for about half a second, right? They also get the big roll distance and they continue running, so it's very easy to kite. But if they just increase the tracking where weapons were more sticky, like the hatchet was pre-nerf, I'm not saying we have to go back to the hatchet. That was pretty OP and very strong. Even though you could block, I don't think melee weapons necessarily need that level of tracking, but they definitely need a middle ground between what hatchet was and what we have now, because it just feels very terrible in my opinion to track a light roly-poly-oly. And you can just see that because it's next to impossible to catch light players in general if they have a rapier paired with. Another thing I feel like they have to address is the healer problem in PvP. Healers have been incredibly overpowered since the release of the game, and they've never once addressed this, and it's just completely disgusting in my opinion. That healers are unkillable if they have rapier on their bar, and they can generally be unkillable if they are paired with something like a void gauntlet. Rapier gives the life staff way too much mobility, and it makes the life staff virtually unkillable. Not only that, but next season we're getting an artifact that gives DR whenever you cast a life staff ability. This will make healers even more unkillable and make them even more frustrating to fight. I feel like a good fix to this is just to not allow rapier and hatchet to be paired with life staff, and we can go from there. And then if it needs to be buffed, we can maybe buff life staff or do some more adjustments there. But I feel like rapier and hatchet being combined with life staff way too oppressive, because the mobility these weapons give should not be able to be provided to a life staff enjoyer. I still think healers would be fine even if you took away these two weapons, rapier and hatchet being paired with life staff. It would just make them a lot more killable, and if they make mistakes that can actually be punished, instead of they make a mistake, they can just spam rapier or hatchet away and they'll be fine. If you guys have any other major problems with New World, be sure to leave them down in the comments below. If I get some, I might make another video. This is just what I've been having the biggest problem at the time, and a lot of people will come into my chat asking me what I generally think are the biggest issues in the game. So I just want to address my thoughts, and I want to do that in this video. If you guys are new here, appreciate a like and subscribe. You can become a YouTube channel member. I really appreciate that. Also want to give a huge shout out to my YouTube channel members and my Twitch subscribers. Thank you so much for the support, guys. It really does mean a lot to me. And with that, I hope you guys all have a fantastic day.